In the spring of 1944, the United States Navy floated upon the vast expanse of the Central Pacific, a creature of such scale and power that it defied historical precedent. It was an institution reborn, a phoenix of steel and fire risen from the ashes of December 1941. The force designated as the Fifth Fleet, and more specifically its lethal core, Task Force 58, represented the culmination of a national effort unparalleled in human history. It was not merely a collection of ships, but a complex, integrated weapons system, the physical manifestation of American industrial might, technological ingenuity, and a hard-won, bloody education in the art of modern naval war. At its heart were 15 aircraft carriers, 7 of them the new 27,000-ton Essex-class fleet carriers and 8 the lighter Independence class. These floating airfields carried nearly 900 aircraft, a number that dwarfed the entire carrier-based air power of any other nation on Earth. The flight decks were crowded with the instruments of this new dominance. The Grumman F-6F Hellcat, a fighter designed with the specific purpose of sweeping Japan's vaunted Mitsubishi A6M0 from the sky. The Curtiss SB-2C Helldiver, a powerful if temperamental dive bomber, and the Grumman TBF Avenger, a rugged and reliable torpedo bomber. This armada was screened by a further 7 fast battleships, 21 cruisers, and 69 destroyers, a concentration of naval gunnery and anti-aircraft defenses that could create a literal wall of exploding metal across miles of ocean. Yet, for all its staggering material strength, it remained an entity with an undertone of anticipation, a weapon forged and sharpened but not yet tested in the ultimate crucible for which it was designed. A decisive, fleet-on-fleet engagement against the Imperial Japanese Navy's mobile fleet. To understand the Leviathan that was Task Force 58 is to understand the American capacity for mass production harnessed for war. The Essex-class carriers, ships like the new USS Hornet, USS Wasp, and USS Lexington, names resurrected from lost predecessors to carry a legacy of vengeance, were being launched from shipyards like Newport News and Quincy Fore River at a rate that seemed to defy the laws of manufacturing. They were designed for endurance and punishment, with superior damage control features learned from the harsh lessons of the Coral Sea, Midway, and the Solomons campaign. The aircraft they carried were the products of a similar industrial miracle. The Grumman Aircraft Engineering Corporation, the so-called Iron Works, was producing Hellcats in such quantities that the Navy could absorb combat and operational losses while simultaneously equipping new squadrons and building a massive reserve. By mid-1944, over 5,000 F-6F fighters had been delivered. In contrast, the Imperial Japanese Navy struggled to replace its losses. Its veteran pilot corps, the elite few who had executed the stunning victories of 1941 and 1942, was a dwindling resource. New Japanese pilots were rushed through a truncated training syllabus, often with as little as a third of the flight hours of their American counterparts. The average U.S. Navy pilot arriving in a combat squadron in 1944 had over 300 hours in his logbook, a product of a vast, systematic training pipeline that stretched from Pensacola, Florida, to bases across the continental United States. The Japanese aviator was often still a formidable and courageous opponent, but he was increasingly outmatched by both the machine he fought against and the pilot in its cockpit. The American pilot flew a heavier, more powerful, and far more durable aircraft, equipped with self-sealing fuel tanks and extensive armor plating, luxuries the lightweight Japanese designs had sacrificed for range and maneuverability. This fundamental difference in design philosophy, one prioritizing pilot survival and the other prioritizing performance at all costs, was about to be writ large in the skies over the Philippine Sea. On the other side of the Pacific, the Imperial Japanese Navy was preparing for one final cataclysmic gamble. Admiral Somu Toyota, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, knew that the inexorable American advance across the Central Pacific threatened the very heart of the empire. The Mariana Islands, Saipan, Tinian, and Guam were the critical link in Japan's inner defense line. From airfields in the Marianas, the new American B-29 Superfortress bombers could begin the systematic destruction of Japan's homeland cities. Their loss was unthinkable. To prevent this, Toyota activated Operation Ego, a plan for a decisive fleet action to annihilate the U.S. Fifth Fleet and halt its amphibious invasion of the islands. The Japanese force, under the tactical command of Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, was a powerful one, centered on 9 aircraft carriers organized into 3 divisions. It included the brand-new armored deck carrier Taiho, a vessel considered by many to be the finest carrier Japan had ever built, alongside the veteran sisters Shokaku and Zuikaku, survivors of the Pearl Harbor attack. Ozawa's fleet could put approximately 450 aircraft into the air. While outnumbered 2-1 in aircraft, Ozawa believed he held several key advantages. His aircraft, particularly the Yokosuka D-4Y Judy dive bomber and the Nakajima B-6N Jill torpedo bomber, possessed a significantly greater combat radius than their American counterparts. This would allow him to locate and strike the American fleet from a distance where the Americans could not strike back. Furthermore, the presence of airfields on Guam and Rota would allow his planes to land, refuel, rearm, and strike the American fleet again on their return journey, a concept known as shuttle bombing. Ozawa, a skilled carrier admiral, planned to use the prevailing easterly winds to his advantage, launching his strikes while remaining upwind of the Americans, further widening the distance as the fleets sailed towards each other. It was a complex and elegant plan, predicated on Japanese tactical skill and superior aircraft range overcoming American brute force. The American strategic objective was, by contrast, brutally simple. As commander of the Fifth Fleet, Admiral Raymond Spruance's primary mission was to seize and secure Saipan. Task Force 58, commanded by the brilliant but taciturn carrier Admiral Mark Mitcher, was his shield. Spruance's orders from Admiral Chester Nimitz, the commander-in-chief of the Pacific Fleet, were clear: to capture, occupy, and defend Saipan, Tinian, and Guam. The destruction of the enemy's fleet was a secondary, albeit highly desirable, objective. This created a strategic tension that would define the opening phase of the battle. Mitcher and his aviators were aggressive by nature. They wanted to seek out and destroy Ozawa's carriers at the earliest opportunity. Spruance, the calculating victor of Midway, was more cautious. His experience had taught him that the primary mission was paramount, and that protecting the vulnerable troop transports and landing forces on the beaches of Saipan must take precedence over a potentially risky chase. This fundamental difference in strategic philosophy would lead to one of the most debated decisions of the Pacific War. The American command structure, while vast, was clearly defined. Nimitz directed the overall strategy from his headquarters at Pearl Harbor. Spruance exercised overall command at sea. Mitcher, aboard his flagship USS Lexington, commanded the 4 carrier task groups that comprised Task Force 58. These groups, designated 581, 582, 583, and 584, were powerful fleets in their own right, each typically consisting of 2 to 4 carriers and their escorts. This modular structure allowed for immense tactical flexibility, enabling the groups to operate independently or concentrate their power as needed. It was this organization that would soon be put to the ultimate test. The catalyst for the collision of these two mighty fleets came on June 15, 1944. On that day, under the thunderous orchestration of naval gunfire from Spruance's battleships, 2 U.S. Marine divisions stormed ashore on the southwestern coast of Saipan. The invasion of the Marianas had begun. For the Japanese High Command, this was the moment of decision. On receiving news of the landings, Admiral Toyota broadcast the signal to his scattered naval forces: activate Operation Ego, from their anchorages at Taui in the Sulu Archipelago and from the Western Caroline Islands. The various components of Ozawa's mobile fleet sortied and began their convergence on the Philippine Sea. The great decisive battle was at hand. The Americans were not blind to this development. A web of signals intelligence, patrol submarine reports, and long-range reconnaissance flights provided Spruance and Mitcher with a growing, if still incomplete, picture of the Japanese approach. On June 15th, the submarine USS Flying Fish made contact with a large Japanese force exiting the San Bernardino Strait. The next day, USS Seahorse spotted another powerful force of battleships and cruisers steaming northward. The pieces of the puzzle were coming together. Ozawa was concentrating his strength and heading directly for them. Aboard the carriers of Task Force 58, the atmosphere shifted from the routine of ground support strikes on Saipan to the tense anticipation of major fleet action. The pilots, many of them young men for whom this would be their first taste of a large-scale air battle, meticulously checked their aircraft. The armorers loaded belts of .50 caliber ammunition into the wings of the Hellcats. On the flag bridge of the heavy cruiser USS Indianapolis, Spruance weighed his options. The reports indicated the Japanese fleet was still hundreds of miles to the west. Should he turn west to meet them, or hold his position to protect the beachhead? The ghosts of past battles and the weight of his responsibility to the men ashore on Saipan heavily influenced his thinking. At the core of the American fleet's defensive power was a revolutionary concept that had been refined through 2 years of war, the Combat Information Center, or CIC. Housed deep within the armored citadel of the carriers and battleships, the CIC was the fleet's neurological hub. It was a dimly lit room, filled with the glow of radar scopes and the quiet hum of electronic equipment. Here, information from the ship's air search radars, like the SK and SP models, was collected, filtered, and displayed on a large, transparent plotting board. Radar operators, their faces illuminated by the green sweep of the cathode ray tubes, called out the range, bearing, and altitude of incoming contacts. Plotters behind the plexiglass board marked these contacts with grease pencils, creating a real-time map of the airspace around the fleet for hundreds of miles. Standing before this board was the fighter director officer, the man responsible for orchestrating the fleet's air defense. By radio, he would vector the squadrons of the Combat Air Patrol, or CAP, to intercept the inbound enemy formations long before they came within sight of the ships. It was a system that transformed air defense from a chaotic scramble into a controlled, scientific process of interception. It allowed the Americans to manage a battle of immense complexity, vectoring dozens or even hundreds of fighters simultaneously to meet multiple threats from different directions. The Japanese had nothing comparable. Their air control was rudimentary, relying primarily on visual sightings and simple radio commands, placing an enormous burden on the individual skill of their pilots. This technological advantage in command and control was matched by a decisive advantage in weaponry. The proximity, or VT, fuse was one of the most significant secret weapons of the war. Designated VT for variable time, this miniature radio transceiver, packed into the nose of a standard 5-inch anti-aircraft shell, was a marvel of ruggedized electronics. As the shell flew through the air, it emitted a continuous radio wave. When it passed near an aircraft, the reflected signal would trigger a detonator, causing the shell to explode. This eliminated the need for a perfect time fuse calculation. Any shell passing within approximately 75 feet of a target would detonate, filling the air with a cloud of lethal shrapnel. For a Japanese pilot flying through an American anti-aircraft barrage, the sky would suddenly erupt around him with black puffs of smoke and jagged steel fragments. The probability of a kill for each shell fired increased by an order of magnitude. Combined with the sheer volume of fire from the dual-purpose 5-inch guns of the battleships, cruisers, and destroyers, and the thousands of 40mm Bofors and 20mm Oerlikon cannons that bristled from every vessel, the VT fuse created a nearly impenetrable curtain of fire around the fleet. For the pilots of the Combat Air Patrol, this shipboard fire was their last line of defense. Their job, orchestrated by the CIC, was to break up and destroy the enemy formations before they ever reached a range where the ship's guns would have to open fire. The instrument for this job was the Grumman F-6F Hellcat. The Hellcat was the product of a direct dialogue between the manufacturer and the combat pilots of the U.S. Navy. Grumman engineers had listened intently to the experiences of pilots flying the F-4F Wildcat against the A-6M0 in 1942. They learned that while the Wildcat was tough, it could not outclimb or outturn the more agile Zero. The Hellcat was designed to negate these disadvantages and leverage American strengths. It was powered by a massive 2,000 horsepower Pratt & Whitney R-2800 double Wasp engine, giving it an excellent rate of climb and a high top speed, particularly at altitude. It was armed with 650 caliber M2 Browning machine guns, carrying enough ammunition to sustain long bursts of fire. Most importantly, it was built like all Grumman aircraft to be exceptionally strong. It could absorb tremendous punishment and still bring its pilot home. While it could not outmaneuver a Zero in a low-speed turning fight, a well-flown Hellcat could use its superior power and speed to dictate the terms of the engagement, using high-side diving attacks and boom-and-zoom tactics that the more fragile Zero could not withstand. For the thousands of newly trained American pilots, the Hellcat was a forgiving and stable gun platform, an ideal weapon for the type of large-scale, high-altitude melees that were anticipated. It was the perfect fusion of industrial production, engineering prowess and combat-derived design philosophy. A fighter built not for elegance, but for annihilation. The days of June 17th and 18th were marked by a rising tension. Task Force 58 had disengaged from its direct support of the Saipan landings and was now steaming in the Philippine Sea west of the Marianas, awaiting Ozawa's fleet. The pilots flew endless, monotonous patrol sectors, their eyes scanning the empty horizon and the cloud-dappled sea. The humid heat of the tropics was oppressive. Men waited, checked their equipment, played cards, and tried to sleep. Aboard the USS Lexington, Mitcher's flagship, the atmosphere was electric. His staff, led by the aggressive Captain Arleigh Burke, argued passionately for turning west to attack the Japanese at the maximum possible range. They believed they had a good fix on Ozawa's position and that a preemptive strike could cripple him. But Spruance, aboard the Indianapolis several miles away, remained firm. His response to Mitcher's proposals was unambiguous. He would not be drawn west and uncover the invasion fleet. He remembered the Battle of Midway, where the Japanese carriers had been caught while rearming and refueling their aircraft for a second strike on the island after their first strike had returned. He reasoned that Ozawa's planes would have to come to him if they wanted to attack the invasion force, and he preferred to fight that battle in a defensive posture, close to Saipan, with his own flight decks clear and his fighters ready. His now famous message to Mitcher summarized his thinking. His primary task was the defense of Saipan. The decision was made. Task Force 58 would hold its ground. It would keep the door shut and let the Japanese come to them. It was a conservative decision, one that would be debated by naval historians for decades, but it was a decision that would lure the Japanese air groups into a perfectly prepared killing ground. In the pre-dawn darkness of June 19, 1944, the great fleets were poised for battle. Ozawa, confident in his long-range strike plan, was approximately 400 nautical miles west-southwest of Task Force 58. At 8:30, he began launching his first wave. 69 aircraft, Zeros acting as escort, Judy dive bombers, and Jill torpedo bombers, lifted off the decks of his carriers and formed up for the long flight east. They were followed shortly by a second, even larger wave of 128 aircraft launched from Ozawa's Central Carrier Group. He was throwing a significant portion of his air power into this initial blow, confident that it would overwhelm the American defenses and inflict crippling damage. Aboard the American carriers, the day began with the routine launching of the Combat Air Patrol. Dozens of Hellcats climbed into the morning sky, taking up their designated patrol stations, their pilots unaware that a massive aerial armada was already flying towards them. On the bridge of the USS Lexington, Admiral Mitcher was a picture of nervous energy, pacing back and forth, his characteristic baseball cap pulled down low. He desperately wanted to know where Ozawa was. Search planes had been launched at dawn, but as the hours ticked by, no definitive contact report had been received. The waiting was agonizing. Then, at 10 o'clock, it began. A radar operator on the battleship USS Alabama called out the first contact. A large group of bogies, unidentified aircraft, bearing west, range 150 miles. The plotters in the CICs across the fleet began to mark their boards. The contact was huge. More reports flooded in from other ships. It was not a reconnaissance flight. It was a major strike. In the flag plot of the Lexington, the tactical situation clarified with chilling speed. The Japanese were coming. The coded signal flashed from the flagship to the rest of the task force. "Hey, Rube!" The old carnival barker's cry for a fight. Now the designated alert for a massed air attack. The effect was instantaneous. On the flight decks, the deafening roar of engines filled the air as every available fighter was scrambled. Hellcats were catapulted into the sky as fast as the deck crews could move them. Within minutes, Task Force 58 had over 300 fighters airborne and climbing to meet the threat. The fighter directors in the CICs went to work, their calm, professional voices cutting through the static, vectoring squadrons towards the approaching enemy. Vector 270, Angels 20. A voice would command, directing a division of Hellcats west at an altitude of 20,000 feet. The system, the immense, complex machinery of air defense, was now fully engaged. The first Japanese strike group never knew what hit them. Flying without the benefit of radar, they were completely unaware that a massive swarm of American fighters was being vectored directly into their path. The Hellcats, holding a significant altitude advantage, came screaming down on the Japanese formation from out of the sun. The battle was a slaughter. Lieutenant Commander Charles W. Brewer, leading fighters from the USS Essex, was one of the first to engage. His Hellcats tore into the Japanese escort, shooting down Zeros and then mercilessly attacking the vulnerable bomb-laden bombers. The Japanese formation, which had been flying in disciplined ranks, disintegrated into a chaotic swirl of individual dogfights. American pilots, many in their first combat, found themselves in a target-rich environment beyond anything they had imagined in training. Radio discipline broke down as excited pilots yelled their victories. Splash 1-0. I got a Judy. The bombers, stripped of their escort, were easy prey. They were systematically hunted down and destroyed, dozens of them falling in flames into the Pacific long before they ever saw an American ship. Only a handful of the original 69 aircraft managed to break through the fighter screen, and these were met by the second layer of the American defense, the terrifying wall of anti-aircraft fire from the fleet. The VT fuses worked with devastating effectiveness, and the few surviving Japanese planes were blown out of the sky. Of the first wave, 42 aircraft were destroyed. Even as the remnants of the first strike were being annihilated, Ozawa's second, larger wave of 128 aircraft was boring in. Again, American radar provided ample warning. Again, the fighter directors in the CICs coolly and efficiently vectored the Hellcat squadrons to intercept. This second engagement, taking place around 11:45, was even larger and more furious than the first. One of the standout American pilots of the day was Commander David McCampbell, the air group commander from the new USS Wasp. A superb pilot and tactician, McCampbell led his squadron VF-15 into the heart of the Japanese formation. The sky became a maelstrom of twisting aircraft, tracer fire, and mushrooming explosions. Lieutenant, junior grade, Alexander Vrashew, a seasoned ace already famous for his exploits in the Pacific, had a particularly memorable day. Flying from the USS Lexington, Vrashew engaged a group of Judy dive bombers and, in a furious 8-minute period, shot down 6 of them, an incredible feat of airmanship and gunnery. He was reported to have landed back on the Lexington and, holding up 6 fingers to his commander, exclaimed his frustration at a malfunctioning supercharger that he felt had limited his score. The sentiment was echoed across the fleet. Pilots returned to rearm and refuel, their gun cameras holding proof of unprecedented success. It was during this phase of the battle that a pilot was famously heard to exclaim over the radio, "Why? This is like an old-time turkey shoot." The name stuck. The greatest carrier battle in history would forever be known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot of the 128 aircraft in the second wave. An astonishing 97 were shot down. While the air battle raged, a second, silent drama was unfolding beneath the waves. The American submarine screen, deployed to intercept the Japanese fleet, was also having its moment. At around 9 o'clock that morning, the submarine USS Albacore, commanded by Commander James W. Blanchard, found itself in a perfect firing position on Ozawa's flagship, the new carrier Taiho. Blanchard fired a spread of 6 torpedoes. One of them found its mark. The damage initially appeared to be manageable. The Taiho was an armored carrier, designed to withstand such hits. However, the torpedo ruptured one of her forward aviation fuel tanks. In a catastrophic error of judgment, the damage control officer ordered the ventilation systems turned on full blast in an attempt to clear the volatile fumes from the ship. Instead, this spread the explosive vapor throughout the carrier's interior. For hours, the Taiho continued to operate, launching and recovering aircraft, seemingly unharmed. But deep within her hull, she was a ticking time bomb. Just after noon, another American submarine, the USS Kavala, captained by Lieutenant Commander Herman J. Kostler, penetrated Ozawa's carrier screen. His target was the 25,000-ton veteran carrier Shokaku. The Kavala fired 6 torpedoes, and at least 3 slammed into the carrier's starboard side. The damage was mortal. Riddled with explosions from aviation fuel and munitions, the Shokaku, A ship that had launched attacks on Pearl Harbor and fought at the Coral Sea and the Eastern Solomons buckled and sank, taking over 1,200 of her crew with her. The loss of a veteran fleet carrier was a staggering blow to Ozawa. Unaware of the full extent of the disaster that had befallen his first two waves, Ozawa launched two more smaller raids during the afternoon. A third wave of 47 aircraft was launched around 1300 hours, and a fourth wave of 82 aircraft, composed largely of planes from his 2nd Carrier Division and float planes from his battleships, was scraped together and sent on its way a short time later. The results were depressingly familiar for the Japanese. The American fighter screen, now battle-hardened and supremely confident, met them far from the fleet and tore them apart. The coordination of the interceptions was masterful. Fighter directors on the Lexington vectored Hellcats from the USS Enterprise and USS Below would to intercept the third wave, destroying 7 aircraft. The fourth wave, in a moment of tragic confusion for the Japanese, mistook a detached American task group for the main body and then, in their search, flew towards Guam to refuel as planned. There, they were intercepted by Hellcats that had been launched from the American carriers specifically to sweep the skies over the island. In a series of swirling dogfights over Guam's Orote Field, another 50 Japanese aircraft were shot down. The shuttle bombing plan had backfired completely, delivering the Japanese pilots into yet another layer of the American meat grinder. By the end of the day, the scale of the Japanese defeat was almost incomprehensible. At 15:30, the time bomb inside the Taiho finally exploded. A massive internal detonation, ignited by a random spark, tore the armored flight deck apart and blew out the carrier's sides. The pride of the Japanese fleet, Admiral Ozawa's flagship, shuddered, rolled over, and sank stern first. Ozawa and his staff were forced to transfer by destroyer to another carrier, the Zuikaku. In the space of a few hours, he had lost his two largest and most capable carriers, not to air attack from Mitcher's planes, but to the silent, unseen torpedoes of 2 American submarines. The contribution of the Albacore and Kavala was immense. They had decapitated the Japanese command structure and removed 2 of the most powerful enemy ships from the battle before they had suffered any significant damage from the air. The fog of war was thick for Ozawa. Reports from his returning pilots were wildly optimistic and inaccurate, claiming multiple American carriers sunk or heavily damaged. But the stark reality was visible on his own flight decks. Of the more than 370 aircraft he had launched in his 4 raids, over 240 had been shot down by American fighters or anti-aircraft fire. Dozens more had been lost in the sinking of the Shokaku and Taiho, or had been shot down over Guam. His offensive air power was, for all practical purposes, gone. Japanese naval aviation had been broken in a single day. As the sun set on June 19th, the pilots of Task Force 58 returned to their carriers. They were exhausted, exhilarated, and in some cases, in a state of shock at the sheer scale of their victory. The debriefing rooms buzzed with stories of incredible dogfights and lopsided victories. The initial tally of enemy aircraft destroyed seemed unbelievable, yet the gun camera footage confirmed it. The turkey shoot was not an exaggeration. It was a simple statement of fact. For the loss of only 29 American aircraft in combat and 6 to operational accidents, they had utterly destroyed the air groups of the Japanese mobile fleet. The official American post-battle analysis would credit the victory to a combination of factors. First and foremost was the overwhelming superiority of the F-6F Hellcat fighter and the high quality of its pilots. Second was the revolutionary effectiveness of the Combat Information Center and radar-controlled fighter direction, which allowed the Americans to achieve a near-perfect interception of every Japanese raid. Third was the devastating power of the VT-fused anti-aircraft shells, which ensured that any aircraft leaking through the fighter screen would face a punishingly lethal defense. Finally, there was Spruance's controversial but ultimately vindicated decision to stay close to Saipan. By refusing to be lured west, he had forced the Japanese to attack at extreme range, fatiguing their pilots and giving his radar ample time to detect them and his fighters ample time to climb to an advantageous altitude. The Japanese plan, so elegant on paper, had shattered against a wall of superior American technology, training, and operational doctrine. Despite the overwhelming victory of June 19th, the battle was not yet over. The Japanese fleet, though stripped of its air power, was still at sea. The debate on the American side now shifted. Having successfully defended the beachhead, should Spruance now pursue and destroy Ozawa's remaining ships? Throughout the night of June 19th and for most of the following day, American search planes scoured the ocean to the west, seeking the fleeing enemy. The search was hampered by distance and poor weather. For Admiral Mitcher, the frustration was immense. He feared that Ozawa would slip away. Finally, late in the afternoon of June 20th, a search plane from the USS Enterprise found them. A report was flashed back to the Lexington. Enemy fleet located 275 miles away. It was a moment of supreme risk and opportunity. The time was 16:21. The Japanese fleet was at the extreme limit of the American aircraft's combat radius. To launch a strike now would mean the pilots would have to fly over 300 miles to the target, attack at dusk, and then face the terrifying prospect of a 300-mile return flight in total darkness. Many would run out of fuel. Losses from ditchings and night landing accidents were certain to be high. Mitcher conferred with his staff. The risks were enormous, but the chance to sink the remaining Japanese carriers was too tempting to ignore. He made his decision. At 1636, Task Force 58 turned into the wind and began launching the strike. What followed was one of the most dramatic episodes of the Pacific War, an operation that would become known as the Mission Beyond Darkness. 216 aircraft, Hellcats, Helldivers, and Avengers, were launched from 10 different carriers. The pilots knew the odds. They were flying on a one-way ticket for many of them. As they flew west into the setting sun, the Japanese fleet, now aware of their approach, prepared for the onslaught. Ozawa had only a handful of fighters left for a combat air patrol, perhaps 35 Zeros. They rose to meet the American Armada, fighting with suicidal courage, but they were hopelessly outnumbered. The American bombers and torpedo planes broke through. In the fading light, they pressed their attacks with skill and determination. Avenger pilots from the USS Below would put a torpedo into the light carrier Hyo, which later sank. Dive bombers scored hits on the carrier Zuikiku and the light carrier Chiyoda, causing serious fires and damage. The battleships ISE and Haruna were also hit. The attack was swift and violent. But as the American pilots turned for home, their greatest challenge lay ahead: the long, dark flight back to the fleet. As the returning aircraft neared the task force, fuel gauges hovered on empty. Pilots began reporting their fuel states, their voices laced with anxiety. One by one, engines sputtered and died, and planes ditched into the black water. Aboard the Lexington, Admiral Mitcher faced a terrible choice. Standard naval doctrine dictated absolute radio silence and darkened ships at night to avoid detection by enemy submarines. But his pilots were out there, lost in the darkness, circling and desperate for a place to land. In an act of profound leadership and compassion, Mitcher made a decision that could have courted disaster for his fleet. He turned to his chief of staff, Arleigh Burke, and gave the order, "Turn on the lights across Task Force 58. The lights came on. Carriers illuminated their flight decks. Searchlights pointed straight up into the sky, creating beacons of hope. Star shells were fired to provide artificial moonlight. The fleet lit up like a Christmas tree, a stunning and dangerous invitation to any enemy submarine that might be lurking nearby. It was a calculated risk, pitting the lives of his pilots against the safety of his ships. For the desperate aviators, it was a miracle. They now had a target to aim for. The landings that followed were chaotic. Decks were crowded, planes crashed into each other, and some pilots, disoriented, landed on the wrong carriers. But the lights saved dozens of lives. Even so, the cost of the mission was high. Of the 216 aircraft launched, only about 100 were recovered without damage. 80 aircraft were lost, either through ditching, crash landings, or operational accidents. Though only 20 planes had been lost to enemy action, the operational losses from this single long-range strike were severe. But the mission had achieved its purpose. It had broken the back of the remaining Japanese fleet and ensured it could not interfere with the conquest of the Marianas. The Battle of the Philippine Sea was over. In 2 days of fighting, the Imperial Japanese Navy had suffered a defeat more catastrophic than Midway. It had lost 3 aircraft carriers, Taiho, Shokaku, and Hayo, and had 2 others heavily damaged. More importantly, it had lost nearly its entire contingent of carrier aircraft, somewhere between 550 and 650 planes depending on the accounting. It had also lost the last of its experienced pre-war pilots. The mobile fleet would put to sea again at the Battle of Leyte Gulf 4 months later, but its carriers would be mere decoys, their flight decks almost empty. Japanese naval aviation, as an effective offensive fighting force, ceased to exist after June 20, 1944. American losses, while significant in the night recovery, were by comparison remarkably light. Total aircraft losses were 123, but many of the crews from the ditched planes were rescued from the sea in the following days. No American ships were lost. The lopsidedness of the victory was a testament to the profound transformation of the U.S. Navy. It had started the war with an aviation doctrine still finding its way and with aircraft that were often outmatched. 2.5 years later, it operated as a seamless, technologically superior system of systems. The battle was the ultimate vindication of the Essex-class carrier, the F-6F Hellcat, the Combat Information Center, and the entire American approach to naval warfare. In retrospect, the battle represents a pivotal moment in the history of warfare. It was arguably the last great, classic carrier versus carrier fleet action in history, and it demonstrated conclusively that the era of the battleship was over and the age of naval aviation was supreme. More than that, it was a victory of an industrial and organizational system. While the courage and skill of individual pilots like Vrashu and McCampbell were celebrated, the true victor was the vast, complex machine that had produced them, armed them, and directed them in battle. It was the victory of the engineers at Grumman and Pratt and Whitney, the scientists who developed radar and the VT fuse, the thousands of workers in the shipyards and factories, the instructors in the training commands, and the planners who had conceived of the logistical chain required to project such power across an ocean. The Battle of the Philippine Sea was not just a battle. It was the physical expression of a nation's entire industrial and technological capacity, brought to bear upon an enemy in a single, decisive engagement. It was the day the latent potential of the American war effort, forged in the fires of Pearl Harbor and honed in the bloody campaigns of 1942 and 1943, was finally and fully unleashed, shattering Japan's naval power and clearing the path for the final advance to the shores of the home islands. The sun that set on the Japanese fleet on June 20th was, in a very real sense, the setting sun of the Japanese Empire itself.